Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm so excited today to dive into My Year in Paris with Gertrude Stein by Deborah Levy. I had to look over and read that. For some reason, that title is just not sticking in my head. I was drawn to the book for several reasons, but one of them, of course, is Paris. Longtime listeners of the Fox Page know that I have a PhD in romance literature, and my area of specialty is in French and Spanish literature, more the Spanish than the French, but I love the French language. This is obviously a book that is not in French. Deborah Levy is someone who was born in South Africa and was raised in Britain. It's written in English, but anything having to do with France is beguiling to me. And then, of course, the idea of Gertrude Stein. Like pretty much everyone, the idea of Gertrude Stein is really interesting to me. I am someone who has attempted to read her prose, and I'm someone who does not actually really like her prose, but I'm really interested in Gertrude Stein as kind of a phenomenon. I also had read nothing by Deborah Levy, and I really was interested in her. She is somebody a little bit like Rachel Cusk, who is known to be this kind of genre-bending writer, or someone like Ben Lerner. There are lots of people out there right now who are pushing the edges of fiction and nonfiction, and she's known as someone who really breaks down those conventions, and I really love that aspect of it. I was also really taken by the cover. You guys know I am someone who is not afraid to judge a book by a cover, and I loved this illustration of these cats. It turns out that Leonora Carrington is the person who did that. She is an artist who was active, during the middle of last century and was really interested in the subconscious and the surreal. So I was I just was taken by the whole thing, this confluence of Leonora, Deborah Levy, and Gertrude Stein. And because of the French, tilt to this whole thing today, I was getting dressed earlier and I was thinking about what I was going to wear. And I realized that it has been a long, long time since the Foxed Page has really dug into any sort of costuming. I've been at this now for 3 years. And in the beginning, there was a lot of actually some pretty elaborate costumes that were going on. At some point, that didn't seem to be quite as interesting, although I'm sort of feeling like I should bring it back a little bit. This top that I am wearing, if you are not on the YouTube and you can't see it, it's like a white and blue horizontal stripe thing, which of course I am hoping is going to evoke some sort of maritime French, boating outfit. It's also by a company called Doan or Doen. I don't think anyone in the United States knows how to pronounce that. It's a clothing company, and I don't know if they're American. I do not think they are French, but I also really like the idea that I'm wearing something that is sort of seeking to be French and is certainly trading on the French diacritical marks, that little accent circumflexe, the little hat, the triangle thing that's over the O. I think Americans find that very exotic, that kind of French writing. No one knows how to pronounce it, but everyone is drawn in. For those of you who like an agenda, here is what we are doing. We're going to talk very briefly in the beginning about Levy, about her background, and about this idea of genre and how she is really bending genre. We're going to talk quickly about the origin story, what was the inspiration for writing this piece of fiction. We're then going to dive in. We'll look at the title. We'll look at genre, because it's very clear here. She says, My Year in Paris with Gertrude Stein. I have to look at the book every time. I just can't get that in my head. But it says that. My Year in Paris with Gertrude Stein. And then underneath the picture of the cats, it says a fiction. It's interesting to me that it does not say a novel. And we're going to talk briefly about that. We're going to talk about the epigraphs, and then we are going to dive into the beginning and take a look at her prose. We're then going to move on and talk about Gertrude Stein herself, a very brief bio, and then a little bit about her writing. First and foremost, the idea of modernism, which we're going to touch on, and I'll give you a definition for. And then we're going to talk about this repetition that has everything to do with her writing, but also is something that I saw a lot of in the Deborah Levy book, which is so interesting. We're going to talk about the 21st century as opposed to the 19th or even the 20th century, and how in many ways this book is really engaging with the 21st century in a way that I found very meaningful. And then we're going to take a look at the novel's close. So we're going to dive in with this very brief bio of Deborah Levy. She was born, as I said, in South Africa. She was born in 1959. Her family is of Lithuanian Jewish descent. They moved to London when she was 9 years old. And she has said in an interview, I listened to one interview, I really liked it. I had to just look it up. It's called the Great Women Artists Podcast. It's with Katie Hessel. It was interesting because it was focusing on visual art as much as anything else, and on the writing of Gertrude Stein. But in that, Deborah Levy herself was saying that it's important that she is not wholly British. Her actual words, she's not fully British. And I think that's a very interesting thing. She's very much, at home in Paris. And my sense is if you spent 9 years somewhere and then moved somewhere else, you would have a feeling of ideally, of being, sort of at home in different places around the globe. She began mostly as a playwright. She had some things that were done by the Royal Shakespeare Company that was relatively successful. She then did some poetry and then moved to novels. She also has some short fiction. She had 2 books that were shortlisted for the Booker Prize and one that was longlisted for the Booker Prize. And I can't really tune into the buzz of the Booker Prize. It's not quite as accessible as, say, the Oscar buzz. But I wonder what the reception of this book is and whether or not this is the kind of thing. I feel like, if you keep getting listed and listed and listed, at some point, it's like you might get, some sort of like body of work award. And certainly she's doing things with genre that are really interesting and actually original and important, and she's pushing literature in a certain direction, which is very evident in this book. If Gertrude Stein was someone who was really, with modernism, was really pushing this brand new vision of art, both in terms of visual art, in terms of painting, but also in terms of writing, she was someone who was really wanting to make it new, which that is the slogan of the modernists. She was really doing some radical things. And it's really fascinating to see the ways in which Deborah Levy is also doing some really interesting things with fiction. Most of all, this idea of sort of mashing these genres together. And in this case, we have not only like an invitation in some ways to see this as autofiction. There are parts of this that feel very autobiographical, but we also have the fiction of the women who are in the book. But then we also have the reality of someone like Gertrude Stein and all of the legends that attend her. But this is a book in some ways, you have biography, you have memoir, and you have fiction. It's really a very interesting mix. And in some ways, I think it's highly successful. In others, I think it's maybe not quite as successful. So in that podcast that I mentioned about the women artists, she did talk about the origin stories of this book. She sat down and was wanting to write essentially a biography or some sort of prose about the relationship between Gertrude Stein and William James. So William James is the brother of Henry James, the important writer. He was someone who knew Gertrude Stein because he was teaching at Radcliffe, which is, I think now it's a part of Harvard. I don't know that it exists anymore, but she was in college there. And William James was a super important philosopher. He's like a very acclaimed philosopher, but he's also someone, he founded the psychology department at Radcliffe, and she wanted to study women's nervous disorders, and he really believed in her, really like encouraged her to kind of go for it. He actually thought she should become an MD, so she went to Johns Hopkins, which we'll dive into her biography in a second. But she essentially was about to become a doctor and just didn't pass all of the exams. There's some kind of extenuating circumstance there. I think there was something to do with what was happening in her life, and that was sort of one of the reasons why she didn't pass her exams. She, by all accounts, she's a very, very bright woman. But Deborah Levy was wanting to write this book about her relationship with William James. It's a very kind of paternal relationship. And she said that what happened is she was just regurgitating everything that she had read about the two of them. And it wasn't interesting to her. She was living in Paris. So she went out and she went for a walk across the Seine, across one of the bridges. And she went to a cafe and she was a sort of absorbing Paris. And then she had this vision, kind of this idea of what if there were several women and they lost their cat? And if the book really had to do with this idea of a lost cat. And what is, beautiful, and what I think is one of the things that works best in this, is that we have someone who is in the fiction, one of those women, is writing the, essentially a book about Gertrude Stein. I do want to take a second to talk about the biography of Gertrude Stein. In this fiction that we are holding in our hands by Deborah Levy, we do end up learning a lot about her. There's some very biographical data that's very helpful. And in many ways, we get this kind of amalgamation. I love the fact that there's actually quite a bit of Gertrude Stein's work in here. At the end of the interview, Deborah Levy said this very interesting thing about how she gave Gertrude back her body, which I think is interesting because I did not get that so much. I had not actually seen these important portraits that people, I think Matisse maybe and Picasso, they did important portraits of her, maybe Cézanne. But what I knew, and what I think most people know, the things that she's famous for, is that she was completely not going to be held down by patriarchal ideas about fashion. I picture her in these big kind of shapeless coats. It's very a Coco Chanel kind of thing where women are throwing off their corsets at the end of the 19th century. So I had this idea of her as having kind of a masculine kind of presence, prototypical kind of masculine, very short hair and kind of clothing that looked actually super comfortable. And I knew that she had a long-term relationship with Alice B. Toklas. And I know that, I really like the idea of her memoir as being something that her life partner would have written when in fact she wrote it. It is also, though, for me, I have a little bit of a hard time because she's really not giving Alice her voice. She's essentially like using Alice as like a ventriloquist dummy here, kind of. I have not read it since college, so I can't speak too much in detail about that. But largely because of the title of that book, I have the idea of the two of them as being, really like linked together in this very strong and unusual relationship. And we do have we have all those sapphic relationships, for example, like Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville West. These are very prominent, like socialite kind of people. Virginia Woolf obviously also being an incredible artist and publisher. But you had some relationships with women who were romantically and physically involved and who were relatively kind of like out, but not a ton of them. And this was a very like high profile one. And it also, in addition to having the relationship with this woman, Gertrude Stein did a lot of things that were uncommon in terms of the patriarchy. She did not have children. They weren't officially married. She did not cook. Apparently all she did was sit there with her one dog behind her neck and the other one on her lap, which as a dog lover, I'm all about that. And I'm actually really happy. Well, the thing I didn't say just now is that she's really known for that salon, and she's known for bringing together all of these men. Like when you think of Gertrude Stein, I think of her as not like a maternal presence, but like a really grounding presence for people like Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Picasso. So she's associated as like supporting all of these men, which is great. But I like the idea also of like really having a better sense of who she is. So we're going to dive into a little bit of a biography here. She was born in 1874 in what is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Her father did some sort of like a clothing company. Her mother died when she was 13 years old, which is just like Virginia Woolf. Her father died when she was 17, and she said something about like kind of like essentially like how life got better after her father died, which is also like Virginia Woolf. She was raised in Oakland, which I really liked. As someone from the Bay Area, I'm totally fascinated by the history of the Bay Area. I'm not enough to actually like do anything about it, but I really like the idea of her having grown up there. She went to Radcliffe, as I mentioned before, and worked with William James. She also went to Johns Hopkins. That's where she got her medical degree. And she went to Paris in 1903 when she was 29 years old. In 1933, she wrote the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. She is the one who coined this term, like the lost generation. In addition to the people I just mentioned, I have here in my notes also Ezra Pound, Matisse. She died in 1946. She was 72 years old. And one piece of the puzzle that I think doesn't get enough like airtime is the fact that she herself was she wrote a lot. She was really invested in the idea of her own fiction and was not happy because it was not as successful as a lot of these other modernist writers whom she was just like hanging out with. She is someone who had an income. And this was an important part of the interview. And it is important to think about. She and Virginia Woolf both had like modest incomes that came from their family. They did have money of their own and a room of their own. We're going to dive in now and talk about the text itself, beginning with the title. If you're someone who is here to get like a richer experience of reading or wants to kind of learn how to read better, all you have to do is slow down and really pay attention. In this case, it's a title that I liked its resonance with lots of other titles. We have a lot of like My Year In or My Year Of, and I like the idea that she's kind of putting herself into this like tradition. I also like how straightforward it is. The emphasis here really is on Gertrude Stein. Paris is obviously something that draws a lot of people, but it's not super surprising to have the idea of Paris together with Gertrude Stein. What is a little bit intriguing and surprising is the idea that Deborah Levy, if you know who she is, if you know anything about her, you would know that she's not a contemporary of Gertrude Stein. So this idea of having a year in Paris with Gertrude Stein is interesting because obviously this is someone who is, like interacting or at least focusing on a dead person. I also always like a book that promises like a time like frame, like we have kind of a discrete amount of time that we're going to be dealing with. I think this is like human nature to like the fact that there's kind of a limit here. I also like that, as I mentioned before, underneath this Leonora Carrington image of these cats, it says a fiction. The significant thing there, of course, is that she's not saying novel, and it's not like a collection of like musings or something like that. It's a fiction. So, I mean, and mostly it reads like a novel. I think she probably could have just said a novel, but I like the way that she's underscoring that she's really playing with all of these different elements of genre. Okay, we're going to dive in now to the actual text, and we're going to look at the epigraphs here. And I think this is an interesting phenomenon. I think mostly I just start reading the text. I think that what is tempting to do here is to like look and see the source of the text, especially with an epigram I use epigram and epigraph kind of like interchangeably. I'm not even sure that that's like how you're supposed to do it. So I don't think I like looked at the source of this. I looked right straight at the text the first time I was reading it. So we have this. About 6 weeks ago, Gertrude Stein said, "It does not look to me as if you were ever going to write that autobiography. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write it for you. I'm going to write it as simply as Defoe did the autobiography of Robinson Crusoe." And she has, and this is it. And then under that, we have the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, 1933, in parentheses, by Gertrude Stein. One notable thing here, we have the paragraph itself is in single quotation marks. In the United States, it would be double, which, I mean, this is an American publisher, so that's a little different than what we would normally see. But what's even more different is that the title of the book, The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, is in Roman type. It's not in italics. And throughout, we have these like ways that Deborah Levy is like not using punctuation in a standard way. And that is very purposeful. I mean, everything in this book is very purposeful. But Gertrude Stein very famously said that she doesn't believe in commas. She must have been taught that kind of like actually really stupid thing that like you're supposed to put in a comma every time you want to take a breath, like that basically a comma is giving you a break so that you can breathe, which is not true. But she said something about how she wanted to be able to take a break anytime she wanted to. I love a comma. I love grammar. I sometimes find it confusing in her work that she does not, in fact, use commas. And I was fine with the idea of Deborah Levy not underlining things, and I like what that is doing, like sort of conceptually. But I don't love it. I don't love it. I would like that actually to. I'm looking at it right now, and I would like it to be in italics. But I also love this as an epigraph or an epigram. I like the idea of pulling something from the autobiography. And I also like the idea of Gertrude Stein and like her voice being up front here. And of course, what's interesting is it sounds like Alice is telling us something that Gertrude Stein said. But we all know that in fact, this is what Gertrude Stein said. We have some repetition here, which we are going to talk about later. Repetition was one of these very important things that she does. It's one of these ways that she was wanting to like make fiction new. She believed in repetition as like insistence. Like it wouldn't make you tired. It should just like really like help you see what the writer is insisting on. So we have a little bit of that repetition here. But what's interesting too, of course, is when we have the idea of Defoe writing Robinson Crusoe, that's a work of fiction. That is a novel. So it's really interesting that Gertrude Stein is playing with genre. I mean, it's actually so fascinating because there's this very meta thing, of course, where it seems as if Alice is writing her own autobiography about herself and mainly about Gertrude Stein, but in fact it is Gertrude Stein taking all of those different voices in this very kind of meta way. She's really playing with the idea of genre, and that's exactly what Deborah Levy is known for. So there are all sorts of ways that these two women, their prose is kind of reinforcing each other's, and it's really, I think, one of the things that this book is doing best. And then the second epigram here we have, "It is a joy to be hidden and a disaster not to be found." And this is in Playing and Reality from 1971 by D.W. Winnicott. This was fascinating to me because recently I've been reading some Karen Horney. She's from last century. She's part of this British school of psychology. So of course Gertrude Stein was very interested in psychology. I like the way that Deborah Levy is pointing us towards someone who is a psychologist. And I had read some Karen Horney, like in psychology classes, but we had always called her Karen Horney. It's Horney. And when my psychiatrist was like, really interested and got me kind of interested in the psychological structures that Karen Horney is putting forward, my psychiatrist kept saying Horney, and I was like, thank you for just making that like kind of like a less kind of ridiculous last name. But I happened to be listening to Karen Horney's book, her like main book, and she's part of this kind of Winnicott like school of thought. So I loved this kind of resonance. And this is one of those things that's really beautiful about work like Rachel Cusk or Ben Lerner or Deborah Levy. If someone is pulling things from all sorts of different, sources and is really playing with the idea of the real world entering into the fiction, there are ways that it can resonate with your real life that feel really different than just kind of like straightforward fiction. Now we're going to dive in to the actual like body of the text. We have the number 1 for the chapter, and then I really like this. We have a place and a time, Paris, November 2024. I remember November 20 actually happened to be in London, and it was horrible because the day after Trump was voted into office again, I had to wait so long before my children were awake, and I was like, in London and just like so worried about them. Like I just was like, I mean, they're in their 20s. They're literally like so old. But I was like, this is so upsetting. It just was like the worst feeling. And like I couldn't talk to anyone in the United States because everybody was asleep. And part of the reason I mention that is that like November 2024, I think it is memorable for that, for the way that the United States like re-upped for another year of like absolute corruption and just not another year. Oh my God, I wish it were. But you know, like another 4 years of just like insanity. And it's actually very germane to think about it that way, in this like very American way, because in fact, Deborah Levy, you know, she was born in South Africa, like raised in Britain. She's living in Paris. She is someone who's not American, but the idea of Trump like looms large, and not large, but like definitely casts a pall over this whole thing. And the idea of all of the wars that are happening in the world, which I mean, I really fault him in many ways. This is a book that in some ways, it's kind of these brief pieces of the text, but they're very important. It really is anchored in the modern day. And the idea of this lost cat, and the idea of like making things new and things changing, and frankly, the idea of the First World War, which was so important for the modernist movement. I mean, we really have like a sense of some sort of echoes in this century that we saw in last century. And I like the way that she's underscoring that. So before we dive into, I want to mention in 2016, a woman named Alice Sprawls, that works by Deborah Levy, quote, almost always begin with a failure of language. And that is so interesting. I love when like I read something and it doesn't even clarify, it just like adds to my understanding of something. Deborah Levy is extremely interested in how language functions, how words function. She's asking that question many times in here, like what are the, like how do words work? And one of the ways to demonstrate like the limits of words is to push them to their limits. And she does that in some really interesting ways. So right at the beginning here, we do in fact have a failure of communication, a failure of language. We have kind of, it's a light kind of misunderstanding. So when I'm reading this first part, pay attention to the failure of language, and also pay a little bit of attention to our narrator. We have a first person narrator here, but it's a slippery one. Deborah Levy also in her work, again, I have not read broadly in her work, but certainly in this case, she likes a very kind of like an unstable narrator. It's not unreliable, but it is a narrator that's like kind of complicated and it's moving around and is kind of shape-shifting in ways that push against the standard kind of realist novel, where you either would have your omniscient narrator or you would have your first person. So here on page 3, we have this. Ava called to say she had lost it. She meant her cat who had gone missing. Ava was my new friend in Paris. We liked not knowing much about each other because there was so much to find out. So I love this. I should have mentioned with the Winnicott thing, the idea of being lost is excellent, but like never being found is a disaster. Ava's cat, the fact that the cat is missing, we have this kind of central thing about like, I don't think the cat's probably hiding somewhere, but there is this sense about like people caring about your absence. And in many ways, obviously, that Winnicott thing has to do with the idea of finding Gertrude Stein, like trying to get kind of a handle on like not where she is, but like who she is, like bringing her back. And I want to talk in just a second about this opening sentence. And again, repetition in this book has everything to do with the fact that Deborah Levy is kind of mirroring what it was that Gertrude Stein was doing in this kind of modernist effort to like make the novel something new. The realist novel from the 19th century just like wasn't functioning anymore because of the cataclysm of the First World War and the Industrial Revolution and the way society was changing, and women, you know, pushing against the idea of the Victorian era. So there was this idea in modernism of wanting to make things new. One of the ways she does it is with repetition. So in the book, Deborah Levy has a lot of ways that she is like mirroring that repetition. This is not one of my favorite ones. In a minute, we're going to look at the ways that in some cases it just felt too cute. But I do have to give her full credit. Like it's right at the beginning here, so it's something we keep returning to, which I think that functions pretty well. So that was page 3. We're going to look at pages 6 and 7. The whole drama, which was a tragedy for Ava, was a relief from writing my essay on Gertrude Stein, about whom I knew too much and nothing at all. Stein had put so much in my way, in the way of understanding. She didn't believe in it. Sometimes when I read her baffling and beguiling writing, I wanted to smack it in the chops. She longed for readers to find her, yet there was part of her that could not bear to be found. She was ashamed of her best-selling autobiography because it was so understandable. When I look at photographs of her, I cannot get into her eyes. Sometimes I had to remind myself of the basic facts. So lost was I in the swirl of information about her. I love everything about this. Again, it's very meta. Like Deborah Levy is writing a book about Gertrude Stein. We know that she was wandering around Paris and came up with this idea. And she's so upfront here. We're like 4 pages into the book, and she's talking about the difficulties of actually being able to find someone, through writing. In this case, being able to find Gertrude Stein through her own writing. She also talks about the visual here. But this is such a delicious callback to the Winnicott idea about how it's a disaster not to be found. And it's so profound what she's saying here about Gertrude Stein, because for Gertrude Stein, she was not found because her like more complicated, more like, modernist writing wasn't something that was selling well. She felt like she had not been found, which for her was a disaster. But I also love how down here at the bottom, when she says, sometimes I had to remind myself of the basic facts. So lost was I in the swirl of information about her. Then we have a space break, and it says this. Gertrude Stein was born in 1874, Allegheny, Pennsylvania, America. Daughter of German Jewish immigrants, her father, Daniel Stein, born in Bavaria, arrived in America in 1841 at the age of 18 to start a clothing business with his brother Solomon. Her mother, Amelia Kaiser, daughter of earlier immigrants from Bavaria. So I love this. So she's talking about like how she can't quite get a hold of Gertrude, and she's like, I had to go back to these basic facts. And it's such a like gift to the reader, and it's like such a nice thing that we just suddenly have this like very biographical, very kind of staccato thing that really tells us a lot about our subject here. It was very important to me that the mother was mentioned. I think it would have been easy to not do that. And it's important to note that Gertrude Stein, she stayed in Paris, even though she is Jewish, through the Second World War, which was really like a dangerous thing for her to do. But Deborah Levy herself is Jewish, so underscoring the idea of German Jewish immigrant forefathers is important here. And the last little chunk that I want to read from the beginning of the book is on the next page, on page 8. So just 5 pages into the fiction. So we have this on page 8. Yet Gertrude Stein struggled to be published and only stepped into fame and gloire when she was nearly 60. She was good friends with a collaborator in the Vichy regime during World War II. Ernest Hemingway described her as having immigrant hair. That's in quotation marks. Then we have a space break, and it says, I had lost it. Who was Gertrude Stein? Which is that echo that we're going to talk about, the idea of I had lost it, the idea of losing something. And then we have another space break, and it says, immigrant hair, period. What do words mean? So there is so much happening here that really gives us a sense of where we are going with this fiction of Deborah Levy's. Like we have kind of like a blueprint here of the larger thing that's going to happen. Because when we go back and we look at this, this idea of like she wasn't able to be published and only stepped into gloire when she was nearly 60. And then we jump from that into she was good friends with a collaborator in the Vichy regime during World War II. Those things are both kind of connected and not. So the beginning of this paragraph talks about like all of the things that were like so privileged about her life and the things that she did that were great, the art collection and bringing together all these modernist artists, both visual and writers. And then we have the yet, and so the end of the paragraph here are things that are kind of more negative, but they don't fit together. Like it's kind of like a weirdly kind of disjointed thing. She has the thing about not having fame, then she has the thing about Vichy regime, and then the last sentence is that one, Ernest Hemingway described her as having immigrant hair. So that is obviously, an anti-Semitic remark that is being made by Hemingway. And Deborah Levy is like kind of mushing all of those things together in a way to show us that it's very difficult to get any kind of like a hold on anyone. The idea of an autobiography or a biography is kind of ludicrous. I mean, you can try, you can give lots and lots of information and try to sort of give all of the different facets of someone. But in a book like this, you can give like a few things like this that feel disjointed just to underscore the ways that any kind of like project like this that means to be really cohesive is going to be limited. I like the idea of her then, I don't love the repetition of I had lost it, and then who was Gertrude Stein, but she's underscoring the difficulty here. And then I like the way that when she talks about immigrant hair, what do words mean? She's underscoring the anti-Semitic part, but she's also really underscoring this question of like, what are we doing with words? Like, how is language functioning? And both Stein and Levy are people who are really pushing language to its edge. They're maxing it out in order to really give that question, like to attempt to answer that question of like, what is it that words do? What do they mean? So I want to just touch briefly on this idea of like having lost it, which is this kind of repetition that for me just got to be a little bit too cute. So I'm going to just read a quick list of some of the instances of it. On page 87 and 88, Gertrude has lost it. And what is it? Her anonymity. On page 95, the narrator has lost it, and that is the thread. On page 100, Alice has lost it, and what has she lost? Drudgery. On page 119, modern art has lost it, and that is representation. On page 137, Stein and Joyce have lost it, and what have they lost? America and Ireland. And then our narrator has all of these different things that she has lost. She's lost this essay, she's lost her love, she's lost her mother, she's lost her brother. And I'm having this experience that I also had with Lost Lambs. There's sort of like a pattern that Madeline Cash has in her writing. And when I pulled it out of the fiction, the novel, and read the examples, they were fine. It just was that there were too many of them in Lost Lambs. And I'm having that same experience here. When I'm pulling these things out of context, the idea of having lost it and what is it, the thread, like that's very interesting. Or the idea of Stein and Joyce as having lost America and Ireland. But there's something about the way it was in the context of the book that just made it feel kind of too cute. There is, in general, in Deborah Levy, and I definitely don't have this with Rachel Cusk, there's kind of a sense that she's either writing in translation or that she's like from a different era. Like the idea that when she was reading Gertrude Stein's work, she wanted to like bust it in the chops. That's like, I feel like that's an expression like my grandparents used. I have this sense of her, of her like lexicon as being at a remove from me. Gertrude Stein talked a lot about wanting to to not use fancy words. She wants her words to be very, very plain and very, very blunt, but she also wants them still to be not understandable. And I think Deborah Levy is kind of stripping language down and using very plain words, but sometimes they feel kind of like from a different generation. So I've talked a little bit about modernism, but I want to look at what Gertrude Stein and Deborah Levy have to say about it. So modernism was a movement in the early part of the 20th century. When you think of modernist writing, you can think of Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, the idea of stream of consciousness. In many ways, it was a reaction to the realist novel that was predominant during the 19th century. So these novels with like these omniscient narrators that were very, or at least attempted to be very like cohesive and straightforward and to like bring order into chaos. After the First World War and industrialization and the Victorian era for women, which was so repressive, you have this group of people who are like, there's so much chaos that we should be reflecting the chaos, not in fact like trying to make order of it or pretend that there's a lot of order in this chaos because there isn't. A lot of that had to do with just the absolute horrors of the First World War. I was so fascinated in the context of that book, Lazar by Nelio Biederman. They talked about how the 20th century European novel is all about like decline and things falling apart. Things like the aristocracy or things like government systems and even like society and personal wealth and like stability in terms of government and war, that the whole 20th century is about sort of like losing things, where in the United States, because we are so weirdly optimistic, and because there was a lot of growth in the 20th century, the whole 20th century novel, like from the 1900, which was like, industrialization. And here in the United States, we'd had that golden era, like when we had all of the growth with the railroads and all of that kind of technological advances. And there's a huge amount of money in the United States. So the 20th century novel in the United States is continuing. It's all about rising up and it's all about getting more and it's all about like productivity and making ourselves better all the time, which is so fascinating. So here with the modernists, they really wanted to make it new. That is the kind of motto of them. So on page 39, the first little chunk here is writing from Gertrude Stein. It's from Everybody's Autobiography. That's a title. You might not know it's a title because it is not, in fact, italicized here, but we do know that it is a novel. And actually, I say that, but I don't know. It might be nonfiction. I think it's a fiction. Unclear, which is actually the perfect segue into this. So it's a brief sentence. It says this: "My writing is clear as mud, but mud settles and clear streams run on and disappear." So I think this is fascinating because her writing, in large part, did not, in fact, it doesn't have a ton of staying power, but her presence and the idea of her writing definitely has endured. So we have that sentence by Gertrude Stein that's quoted by Levy, and then we have this: "I wanted my essay to be a clear stream, but there was so much going on. A lost cat, Ava's missing husband, the vast menu of Fanny's erotic conquests, finding my way around Paris, the temptation to put down Stein's writing and read Georges Simenon instead. The streams were flowing through the 19th century into the 21st century and all over the place. Were they streams of consciousness? For some reason, I felt the need to defend Gertrude Stein. Every century needs an artist to dismantle coherence as we have been taught it and make a space for something new to happen. So importantly, that is the blurb that they have on the back copy of the book. And I think it's a good one for that. I mean, that is really what Gertrude Stein was doing. Deborah Levy mentioned at some point Gertrude Stein was trying to write in a way that was cubist, like the Picasso thing, sort of like dismantling stuff. And Deborah Levy was like, that's a terrible way to write. Like, that is not a good idea. And I really like the fact that, especially in this interview, but also in this book, there is a healthy amount of she's not taking these things too seriously. Deborah Levy isn't. And she isn't, this is not like some sort of hagiographic, like she's not just like thinking that that Gertrude Stein is like the best thing ever. It's not, you don't get a sense of her as being really starry-eyed, which is important because you are getting a more sort of even and kind of neutral look at this important figure. So I just want to read one more brief paragraph about modernism. It's on page 167. And there is a single quotation mark here, so you should be alerted that this is some sort of quotation. What does literature do, and how does it do it? Oh, there also aren't any question marks because Gertrude Stein, not only did she not believe in commas, she also didn't believe in question marks. She had the sense that, like, you would know if something is a question, and often you do. I will defend, though, the question mark. I think as a concept, sometimes you really actually do need that question mark. Okay, it's on page 167. What does literature do, and how does it do it? And what is the difference between what it sees and what it knows? And then, too, there is what it feels, and then also there is what it hopes and wishes. And the title of this this piece is What is Literature? That's in single quotation marks, in Lectures in America. So Gertrude Stein did come to the United States, and much is made of the fact that when she arrived in Times Square, like on the big like ticker tape thing, it's not really ticker tape, I don't know, like the big like neon board thing, it said Gertrude Stein has arrived. I mean, which really is important. It tells you like the stature that she had even when she was alive, even if her actual fiction was not something that people were reading a lot. And I love the idea here of a good modernist who is really questioning what it is that literature does and what it is that English literature does. What we have here also is a lot of repetition, and we have a lot of just like open-ended questions without question marks. And I find it interesting, but I also think that there's a way that it's just not very satisfying. And I don't always need, like answers to questions, but I think there's a way, I was going to say that it feels kind of naive, and actually I'm just going to say that. I'm going to let that stand. And then after we have the attribution, and we know this is Lectures in America, we have a space break, and it says, obviously all question marks had left the building and were smoking outside. And my note next to that is too cute. I do think that's actually too cute. I don't think that was necessary. I like the idea of like bringing us back to this punctuation thing. And I kind of think like maybe using that cliche, like had left the building, that would have been fine. The smoking outside, I was like, it just felt a little bit too cute to me. There was also one chunk of the Gertrude Stein, which we are not going to read, that I just like in my margin, it just says like, what? And all these question marks, because it truly was like mud. This is just like not clear. And I want to read, just to finish up this modernist thing, there are two brief paragraphs of Levy kind of like weighing in on some of this stuff. On page 81, Deborah Levy says this: writing was Stein's way of avoiding everything. It seems to me that repetition was her way of moving closer to her enquiry, but never getting there. After all, what might she find? Find there. I'm not sure bottom character interested her as much as she thought it did. Bottom character is being sort of, it's like a psychological term for her. It's more about like, what is the true essence of someone? So she goes on, is it exciting to put things in the way of being understood? I think it is. Often I do that myself. Put things in the way. Yet, to be relentlessly transparent or relentlessly opaque is not how the human mind is wired. So I love that. I mean, I'm also like, thank you, Deborah Levy, for not being entirely opaque, but also this idea of like having the reader have to work a little and think about how it is that language is functioning. And on 90, I like this little paragraph that we have at the end. This is the end of a chapter, which is important. And it's a way that Deborah Levy is allowing this kind of modernist thing to be more evident in her writing and in Gertrude Stein's, and just talk about how relevant it still is in 2024. So on page 90, we have this. All of this was part of the overflowing streams of consciousness and they would all intermingle and flow and empty into modernism and modernisms, and no one knows where it begins and ends. So I like that too, because here she's underscoring, I mean, it's very easy to be like, oh, modernism was an art movement from like 1910 to blah, blah, blah. And she's really pushing not only against the idea of genre, but the idea of like how these things begin and end. And like this is like that, very human urge to make things not chaotic and to understand them and to really be able to put them into little boxes, which is entirely against the whole entire like idea of modernism. So I like the way that even like structurally here, she's like, all of this is kind of mixing in and no one knows where it begins or ends. And that is the whole point of both modernism for Stein, but also a lot of the ways that Levy is working. So we're going to close by looking at a couple passages at the end. But as I was moving toward page 212, I came across the little chunk where I was like, what? My handwriting is insane here because I'm just like so deranged about the whole thing. It's on page 207, and I'm just going to read this tiny paragraph to you. I like loving. I like mostly all the ways anyone can have of having loving feeling in them. Slowly, it has come to be in me that any way of being a loving one is interesting and not unpleasant to me. That is so funny. I read that and I'm like, that's totally clear. She just likes being someone who loves. I don't know what I was thinking. I mean, honestly, I think I was so primed to kind of like dismiss all of this repetition that I also just was like probably not reading very carefully. But this idea of repetition was such that I'm like, okay, I know love, I know love, I know love. But that is funny because that actually does make a lot of sense. So we are going to go now to page 212, where we're going to look at two parts of the ending here. So on page 12 here, it's after a space break. Gertrude Stein, and then we have a new paragraph. Naming herself a genius was a stroke of genius. Everyone would argue about it forever. Obviously, I love everything about that. Like, she really is held up as this very strong, like very talented and important person. And then we have a space break. If we create ourselves with and through language, it seems to me that Gertrude Stein's project was to dismantle herself and a whole century through language, to uncreate herself as she had been created by her father, by her sneering professors at Johns Hopkins, by her brother, to undo the manner of the 19th century. Get rid of commas, get rid of question marks. She did not want to be told when to take a breath and when something was a question, or who to love, or how to dress. I love this. And this is very generous of Deborah Levy at the end here on 212. We're moving quickly toward the end of the novel or the fiction. And she's giving us like this kind of summary of what it is that we've got, like all of these different pieces that we have learned. And we've got some nice repetition here. And we've also got this sense of like synthesis. And of course, I love the like anti-patriarchal tone to a lot of this. But we're underscoring here the importance of language. Like she's making herself through language. And I love the way that this is put together with the idea of naming herself a genius. So I want to read the last two pages. It's actually the last three. So here we are on page 226. And this is a point when actually the narrator here, this first person narrator who's in Paris and working on this book about Gertrude Stein, her house is being overrun by mice and it's really like driving her crazy. It's funny. I don't really have a thing about mice. Mice are like, they don't freak me out at all. We grew up going to a house in the mountains that had tons of mice. Like literally, we would go there to ski, and you would have to like put your hand in your ski boot at the beginning of every season because often there would be like a little nest in there, or sometimes actually like a little cadaver. But for whatever reason, mice don't bother me at all. And in New York, we have we like to call him Scampers. He's this little mouse that runs around. But honestly, I think he probably is many different mice. And to be totally honest, I think probably Scampers, cute Scampers, is actually a rat. And this thing about like not having like a problem with rodents, I still don't have a problem with rodents. And that was 100% reinforced when we had bed bugs. It was complete insanity. It was like literally my worst nightmare. It went on and on and on forever. My husband kept saying this thing. He would like tell everybody, he'd be like, we have bed bugs, but we're not bad people. So we like to talk about it. We're normalizing bed bugs. Like why so secretive, you know? On page 226. A mouse ran across the room and started to frolic on the key limbs. It turned to look at both of us. It almost waved. It seemed to love the peppermint oil. This book is not that funny, but I loved that line, and I have ha and like a little heart in the margin here. She got peppermint oil because they're supposed to be like repelled by it. So it's very cute here. It says it seemed to love the peppermint oil. And then a new paragraph. So Gertrude Stein made a life in France, and you will be making a life in America, I said to Ava. Yes, she replied. That's what modernism is all about. How we put ourselves together. Ava touched the ends of her fringe, which she had trimmed that morning. So fringe, of course, being her bangs. There's a lot of nice echoes of hair. We have the immigrant hair comment in the beginning, and there's a lot of stuff about Ava, like trimming her hair and hair in general. My hair looks actually totally insane right now. Not great. And my roots are really crazy. I have an appointment tomorrow, but I also am really rethinking the idea of like highlighting hair. For those of you who don't know, Carol Claire Burke has a podcast called Diabolical Lies. I listened to their episode, which happened to be about hair as like gender affirming and like really like performative. I mean, obviously. And if you're on YouTube, oh my God, look how dark my hair is. I'm definitely not meant to be blonde. I was blonde when I was little, and then I just kept that blonde, even though like I really should have dark hair. It's terrible. It's like this total patriarchal thing about like beauty standards in this country of ours. These are crazy digressions, but also it's very modernist. I'm telling you all how I'm putting myself together, like how it is that I'm presenting myself to the world and to be understood. So Ava touches the edges of her fringe, which she had trimmed that morning. "Goodbye, Ava," I said. "I will miss you, and I don't think I will ever write my essay on Gertrude Stein." So I loved the meta there, partially because she does, in fact, write it. And I mean, if we are going to conflate the narrator and the author of this book, we have the thing in our hands, so we know that she did. But we also have this lovely echo of Gertrude Stein's own autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, because at the beginning of that, which we have very handily at the beginning of this book, she says, "I'm never going to write this thing." So it's very nice that we have that echo here. So she says, "I'm never going to write the essay." "Yes," she replied, "and given you are flirting with a snow leopard and fighting with mice, I will write it for you," which is so lovely. "I reckon the title will be My Year in Paris with Gertrude Stein, but as it will mostly be about the anguish of preparing to make my way to Seattle, I might call it The Making of an American." And that's really lovely because one of Stein's books is called The Making of Americans. So it goes on. "She gripped the umbrella I had passed to her and kissed me on both cheeks. But I don't think anyone can ever get to the bottom of it." So I love that, just this idea. I mean, we're at the very close here, and this narrator and her friend are acknowledging that you're never going to get to the bottom of who she was. It's also nice to repeat that word bottom because, when Gertrude Stein was thinking about psychology, what she was interested in was the bottom people. Is that what she said? Yeah. That idea of kind of like the essence of someone. So I thought that was the end of it because it really does work well, just like you're never going to get to the bottom of this person. And then I turned the page and there was more. On 228, we have this. And it's actually so lovely. I'm really happy about this edition. It almost reads like an epilogue or like another epigraph. But on 34, we have this. There's a single quotation mark. "And identity is funny. Being yourself is funny, as you are never yourself to yourself, except as you remember yourself. And then, of course, you do not believe yourself." That is from Everybody's Autobiography, which of course is not italicized. I really like this. I like that feels sort of like playful to me, and it also is. It's a perfect example of this kind of repetitive stuff that she's always doing with this very stripped down language. And I like the idea it's repeating the word funny. A lot of this is really working really well. And it's such a good way to kind of synthesize the whole thing. I also love the fact that Gertrude Stein is like getting the last word here. Speaking of the last word, I think we're going to leave it there. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that today gave you a little better understanding of the incredible ways that Deborah Levy is not only like resurrecting Gertrude Stein, but is also really giving us a sense of what that project was and how that project is really very much ongoing. So thanks so much for tuning in. Happy reading.